Imagine this. You are standing behind the controls of a speeding trolley. It's not slowing down. It's not even trying to slow down. 60 miles an hour, straight down the track, and in the distance, you see 5 workers. They don't see you. They don't hear you. And you already know what happens next. You reach for the brakes. Nothing. Dead. Useless. Panic sets in, because in a matter of seconds, 5 people will die, and you will be the one who kills them. But then you notice something. Off to the right, there's another track, a side track, and on that track, there is one worker, just one. Now suddenly, you're not helpless anymore. Your hands are on the steering lever. You have a choice. If you do nothing, 5 people die. If you act, if you pull that lever, you will divert the trolley and kill one person instead. So what do? Do you intervene and intentionally cause the death of one person to save 5? Or do you step back and allow 5 people to die simply because you refuse to act? This is not just a question, this is a test. And when people are asked this, most don't hesitate for long. Most people choose to turn the trolley. 5 lives matter more than 1. It feels obvious. It feels logical. It even feels moral. But the moment you start asking why, things begin to unravel. Because what you're really saying is this: it is acceptable to take a life if it leads to a better outcome. It is acceptable to choose who dies as long as more people survive. And that idea, simple on the surface, has consequences that go far deeper than this one scenario. Now let's change the situation. Same trolley, same speed, same 5 workers at the end of the track. But this time, you are not the driver. You are standing on a bridge, looking down at the track below. The trolley is coming. The 5 workers are still there. Nothing has changed, except your position. You're not controlling the trolley. You're just watching it. Helpless, or so it seems, because standing next to you is a man, a large man, leaning slightly over the edge of the bridge, and in a split second, a thought crosses your mind. If he were to fall, his body would land on the track, the trolley would hit him, it would stop, the 5 workers would live, but he would die. So now the question changes. Not, would you pull a lever, but this: would you push a man to his death to save 5 others? And suddenly, everything feels different. Because even though the numbers haven't changed, 5 versus 1, the decision feels heavier, more personal, more wrong. Most people who would pull the lever refuse to push the man. And that's where the real problem begins. Because logically, the outcome is the same. 1 life lost, 5 lives saved. But emotionally, morally, something shifts. And the question becomes, why? Why does turning a lever feel acceptable, but pushing a person feels like murder? Some people say it's about direct action, that in the first case, the death is a side effect, but in the second case, the death is the means. You are not redirecting harm, you are creating it. Others argue it's about involvement. In the first scenario, you're already part of the situation. In the second, you insert yourself into it. You choose to become the cause. And that difference changes everything. Or does it? Because if you think about it long enough, the lines start to blur. Turning the trolley is still a decision, still an action, still a conscious choice to end a life. So why do we treat it differently? That's the tension at the heart of moral thinking. And it doesn't stop there. Let's take it even further. Imagine you are now a doctor. 6 patients are brought into your emergency room. 5 of them have moderate injuries. 1 of them is critically injured. You can save the 5, but only if you ignore the 1. Or you can focus all your time on the 1, knowing the 5 will die. What do? Most people choose to save the 5, Again, the numbers win. But now consider a different version. You are a transplant surgeon. 5 patients will die without organ transplants. Each needs a different organ: heart, lung, kidney, liver, pancreas, and there are no donors, no time, no options until you remember. In the next room, there is a healthy man. He came in for a routine checkup. He's sleeping. If you take his organs, he will die, but you will save 5 lives. So now the question becomes unavoidable. Would you kill one healthy person to save 5 dying patients? And almost everyone says no. No hesitation, no debate, no justification, just no. And now the contradiction is impossible to ignore, because in every case, the math is the same. 1 life for 5. But our judgments change depending on how that trade happens. When it feels indirect, we accept it. When it feels intentional, we reject it. So, what does that say about morality? Is it about outcomes, or is it about actions? Is saving more lives always the right thing to do? Or are there lines we refuse to cross, no matter the result? These questions aren't just philosophical games. They shape how we think about real decisions: war, law, medicine, justice. Because every system we build, every rule we follow, is based on some answer to these questions, even if we don't realize it. And the deeper you go into this, the more uncomfortable it becomes. Because you start to see that your instincts aren't always consistent. Your logic isn't always stable. And your sense of right and wrong can shift depending on the situation. Not because you're confused, but because morality itself is complicated. It's not just about numbers, and it's not just about feelings. It's something in between, something we're still trying to understand. And that's exactly where this journey begins. Because once you start questioning these decisions, once you start noticing the contradictions, you can't go back to seeing things the same way. And that's the real point. Not to give you answers, but to make you aware of the questions you've been answering all along, without even realizing it. Now let's take a step back, because by this point, something should feel slightly off. In every scenario you've just seen, the numbers stayed the same. 1 life versus 5. The math never changed. And yet, your answer probably did. You were willing to pull a lever. You refused to push a man. You chose to save 5 patients over 1, but you rejected the idea of harvesting organs from an innocent person. Same outcome, different reaction. So what's really guiding your decisions? Is it logic, or is it something deeper? Because if morality were only about results, every one of these choices should feel the same, but they don't. And that difference reveals something important. There are 2 powerful ways people think about right and wrong. The first is simple. You judge an action by its consequences. If the outcome creates more good than harm, then it's the right thing to do. Save 5 lives instead of 1? That's better. Reduce suffering? That's better. Maximize happiness? That's better. This way of thinking sounds practical, efficient, even fair. It treats every life as equal, but also as part of a larger calculation. And in that calculation, numbers matter. But then there's a second way of thinking, one that doesn't start with results. It starts with principles, with rules, with lines you do not cross, no matter what. According to this view, some actions are simply wrong. Not because of what they lead to, but because of what they are. Killing an innocent person is wrong. Using someone as a means to an end is wrong. Taking a life, even for a greater good, can still be unacceptable. And this is why pushing the man off the bridge feels different. Because in that moment, you are not redirecting harm. You are creating it. You are choosing someone and deciding they must die. And something inside you resists that, even if 5 others could be saved. Now here's where it gets uncomfortable. Because both ways of thinking make sense, and both lead to completely different answers. One says, maximize the outcome. The other says, respect the rule. And in real life, you don't get to choose one system and ignore the other. You're constantly pulled between them, sometimes without even realizing it. Now let's move away from thought experiments for a moment and step into something real, a true story, a situation that actually happened. 4 men were stranded at sea. Their ship had sunk. They escaped on a lifeboat. No food, no water, just the open ocean and time slowly running out. For days, they survived on almost nothing. A small amount of food, a little hope, but eventually, even that was gone. And after nearly 3 weeks, their bodies began to fail. One of them, a young cabin boy, became sick, weak, delirious. He had drunk seawater against advice, and it made things worse. He lay at the bottom of the boat, barely conscious. And that's when the idea came up. What if one of them had to die so the others could live? At first, they considered drawing lots. A fair system. Everyone takes the same risk. Everyone accepts the outcome. But that never happened. Instead, one man made a decision. He chose the weakest among them, the boy. He said a prayer, and then he killed him. The others joined in. They consumed his body to survive. And a few days later, they were rescued, alive. When they returned home, they were put on trial, not for survival, but for murder. Now the question is simple. Were they justified? Were they wrong? Or were they something in between? Because if you think back to everything we've just explored, this situation forces you to confront it in a way that's no longer abstract. This isn't a lever. This isn't a hypothetical man on a bridge. This is real, a real life taken to save others. Some people defend them. They say survival changes everything, that extreme situations demand extreme decisions, that when faced with death, you do what you have to do. And maybe that's true, but others disagree. They say necessity does not erase morality, that choosing to kill, even in desperation, is still wrong, that crossing that line changes something fundamental. And once you allow it, where does it stop? Because if survival justifies anything, then anything can be justified. And that's a dangerous place to stand. Now, some people try to find a middle ground. They say the real issue wasn't the act itself, but how the decision was made. There was no agreement, no consent, no fair system. The boy didn't choose. He wasn't asked. He was selected. So what if things were different? What if they had all agreed beforehand? What if they had drawn lots and accepted the result? Would that make it right? For some people, yes, because now the decision isn't forced, it's shared, it's mutual. Everyone accepts the risk. Everyone participates in the outcome. But even then, not everyone is convinced, because consent under pressure isn't always real consent. And when survival is at stake, how free is that choice? Would anyone truly volunteer, or would they just accept because they have no other option? And even if they did agree, does that make killing acceptable, or does it simply make it easier to justify? These are not easy questions, and there are no clean answers, because every angle you take leads to another problem. If you focus on outcomes, you risk justifying anything. If you focus on rules, you risk ignoring reality. And if you try to balance both, you end up in a constant struggle. But that struggle is the point, because morality isn't supposed to be comfortable. It's not supposed to give you easy answers. It's supposed to challenge you, to force you to think, to question not just what you believe, but why you believe it. And once you start doing that, you begin to see something deeper, that every moral decision you make, every judgment, every reaction is built on principles you may have never examined until now. Now here's where everything comes together, because up to this point, you've seen the tension between outcomes and principles, between saving more lives and refusing to cross certain lines, between logic and instinct. But there's one question that sits underneath all of it, a question that quietly controls every decision you've been making. Why does any of this matter at all? Why should one life count the same as another? Why should fairness matter? Why should rules exist if breaking them could lead to a better outcome? And more importantly, who decides? Because whether you realize it or not, every answer you've leaned toward so far is built on a belief about what makes something right or wrong. Not just what feels right in the moment, but what should be right. And that's where philosophy stops being abstract and starts becoming personal, because now it's not about the trolley, it's not about the lifeboat, it's about you, the way you see the world, the way you judge people, the way you justify your own decisions. Because every day, in small ways, you're making choices based on these same principles. Who deserves your time? Who deserves your loyalty? What's worth sacrificing? What's worth protecting? And most of the time, you don't question it. You just act. But the moment you start examining those choices, something changes, because you begin to notice the inconsistencies, the contradictions, the places where your beliefs don't quite line up with your actions. And that realization is uncomfortable, not because it's wrong, but because it's honest. You start to see that morality isn't something fixed. It's something you're constantly navigating, constantly adjusting, constantly trying to make sense of, and that process never really ends. Now there's a temptation at this point, a very natural one, to step back and say, well, there's no clear answer. That's just your opinion. Everyone sees it differently. And on the surface, that sounds reasonable. After all, people do disagree. They always have. They always will. But here's the problem with stopping there. If everything is just opinion, then nothing can be challenged. Nothing can be improved. Nothing can be questioned. And that means nothing really matters, because the moment you give up on reasoning about right and wrong, you stop trying to understand it. And when that happens, you don't become more open-minded. You become passive. You accept things as they are, instead of asking whether they should be that way at all. But the fact that these questions keep coming back across different situations, different cultures, different generations, that tells you something. It tells you they're not meaningless, they're unavoidable. Because whether you think about them or not, you're already living by some answer. Every decision you make reflects it. Every judgment you pass reveals it. And that's why this matters. Not because you'll find a perfect answer, but because the process of questioning changes how you see everything. It sharpens your awareness. It exposes assumptions you didn't know you had, and it forces you to take responsibility for the beliefs you act on. That's the real shift. Not learning new information, but seeing familiar things in a completely different way. Because once something becomes clear, you can't unsee it. You can't go back to the way you thought before. It stays with you, quietly influencing how you interpret situations, how you respond to conflict, how you define what's fair and what isn't. And that's where the real challenge begins, not in answering one question, but in continuing to ask better ones. Now think about the stories again, the trolley, the bridge, the lifeboat. At first, they feel like distant scenarios, extreme situations you'll probably never face, but that's not why they matter. They matter because they strip away distractions. They isolate the decision. They force you to confront the principle underneath. And once you see that principle, you start recognizing it everywhere. In laws, in policies, in everyday interactions. Because every system we build, every rule we follow, is based on some version of these same ideas. Do we prioritize outcomes? Or do we protect certain boundaries no matter what? Do we accept trade-offs? Or do we reject them entirely? Do we calculate value? Or do we treat it as something absolute? There's no escaping these questions, only different ways of answering them. And each answer comes with consequences, not just theoretical ones, but real ones. The kind that shape lives, the kind that shape societies, the kind that shape you. So the goal isn't to walk away with certainty, it's to walk away with awareness, to recognize that behind every obvious decision, there's a deeper reasoning. And behind every strong reaction, there's a belief worth examining. Because once you start doing that, you stop reacting automatically. You start thinking deliberately. You stop accepting things at face value. You start questioning them. And that's where growth happens. Not in having all the answers, but in refusing to ignore the questions. So the next time you face a decision, big or small, pay attention. Not just to what you choose, but to why you choose it. Because that why, that's where everything begins. And once you understand that, you're no longer just reacting to the world. You're actively shaping how you exist within it. That's the difference. That's the shift. And that's the real purpose of this journey. Not to tell you what to think, but to make sure you never stop thinking at all.